The city lights blinked like tired stars against the velvet of a sleepless night. Traffic hummed far away, a distant lullaby that could not reach the quiet ache inside Grace's chest. The world moved on, but her heart remained still, stuck in a moment she couldn't name, only feel. She sat by the window of her small apartment, wrapped in an old blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and rain. Her eyes were dry, not for lack of tears, but because they had already given all they had. Sometimes weariness did not look like sobbing. It looked like silence. It sounded like nothing. Grace had always been the one others leaned on. The friend who had it together, the girl who smiled in photos, made perfect notes in her planner, and kept everything, every feeling neatly folded inside. But now she was unraveling quietly, thread by thread, behind closed doors. That evening she had come home from work, dropped her keys on the counter, and sat on the floor without even taking off her shoes. The world had felt heavy, not with disaster, not with chaos, just with everything. A missed deadline, an empty refrigerator, a birthday no one remembered, a call she couldn't return. It was the small things that chipped away at her spirit until the cracks were wide enough to echo. She looked at her reflection in the dark window, half shadowed, half lit. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," she whispered, not even sure who she was talking to. The apartment didn't answer, neither did the sky, but something inside her stirred. It wasn't a voice, not quite, more like a hush, a presence, a knowing. It sat with her. It didn't fix anything. It didn't take away her fatigue, but it didn't leave either. Grace hugged her knees to her chest and let her breath slow down. There were no perfect prayers. She had no strength for them. But under her breath, like a sigh wrapped in surrender, she said, "Jesus, if you're there, I need you." The words fell into the stillness like a stone into deep water, silent at first but rippling outward through her soul. She didn't hear anything in reply, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel quite so alone. The blanket around her shoulders suddenly felt warmer. The quiet didn't press in so hard. And though nothing had changed, something had. Something invisible, something sacred. And that night, for the first time in a long while, Grace didn't fall asleep crying. She simply rested. With emptiness still in her, yes, but also a whisper of hope. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, someone had heard her and was already walking toward her in the quiet. Night had become a strange companion to Grace, neither enemy nor friend, but something in between. It greeted her with silence and watched her quietly fall apart beneath the covers. Sleep used to be a place of escape, a gentle forgetting. Now it was a battleground. Her body was tired, but her mind wouldn't rest. Thoughts ran like rivers in flood season, crashing into each other with relentless force. "I forgot to reply to that email. I didn't return Mom's call. I'm falling behind again. Why do I feel like I'm always failing?" The questions circled endlessly in her chest. Sometimes they came with no answers. Other times they came with a sharp whisper. "Because you are not enough." Grace hated that voice. It sounded like her own, but darker, like her fears had learned how to speak. She tried everything to hush it: warm tea, soothing music, reading, scrolling through pictures of sunrises on her phone. But nothing helped. Her bedroom was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the street lamp outside. Shadows danced across the ceiling, moving like silent ghosts. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and curled up, but her eyes remained wide, watching the stillness. Tonight felt heavier than usual, heavier in her bones, in her breath. She tried to cry, hoping it would bring release, but the tears stayed hidden, like her strength. Grace reached for the small wooden cross on her nightstand, the one her grandmother had given her as a child. It was smooth from years of being held, the edges worn soft. She clutched it now, not out of habit, but because she had nothing else to hold. She didn't speak aloud. Not really, but in her spirit, there was a whisper, a longing, a question she didn't dare fully form. "Are you really there, Jesus? If you are, why do I feel so alone?" Her breath hitched, and then nothing. No answer, no vision, No voice breaking the stillness, just her in the dark. But then, a memory, faint, fragile. She was 8 years old, lying on her grandmother's couch after a nightmare. Her grandmother had sat beside her and whispered, "Jesus is here, sweet girl. He's always watching over you, even when you can't see him." Back then, those words had made her feel safe. Tonight, they felt far away, like echoes in a canyon. And yet, something in them stirred her heart. Maybe she wasn't asking for proof anymore. Maybe she was just asking for presence, not a miracle. Just someone to sit with her in the dark. She turned on her side and looked at the cross again. "I'm trying to believe you're near," she whispered, voice shaky. "But I'm tired, Jesus. So tired." Outside, the wind stirred the branches, and they tapped gently against the window. Soft, rhythmic, like a lullaby. Grace's eyes, heavy from the weight of emotion, began to close. She didn't fall into sleep like someone diving into a pool. She drifted, slowly, carefully, into rest, as if unseen arms had gently caught her. She didn't know it then, but Jesus was there, sitting beside her, watching over her, weeping softly with her in her sorrow. And when she finally slept, her breath came easier, because heaven had heard her silent tears, and the one who loved her most had not turned away. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. The sky was unusually quiet, overcast and unmoving, like the world had paused without telling anyone. Grace had just finished a meeting, her mind buzzing with tasks and half-finished thoughts, when her phone rang. It was her mother, and with 3 softly spoken words, everything changed. "She's gone, honey." The rest was a blur. Words like, "peacefully," and "in her sleep," and "she loved you so much." But Grace couldn't hold on to any of them. They slipped through her like sand through open fingers. All she could grasp was the ache. Her grandmother, her safe place, her quiet anchor, was gone. Grace didn't cry at first. The silence inside her was too loud, too deep. It stretched endlessly, like a winter sky without stars. She walked out of her apartment that night, phone forgotten on the table, and wandered without direction. The city moved on around her, cars, people, laughter in the distance. But it felt like none of it touched her. She was moving through a world that no longer felt real. The grief didn't come in waves, it came in stillness, in the absence, in the things that didn't happen. No more late-night calls with soft prayers. No more wrinkled hands brushing Grace's hair behind her ear. No more, "Jesus loves you, sweet girl, and so do I." The loss was sharp, but not loud. It whispered in every moment she used to share with her. Grace found herself at a small park, the one her grandmother used to walk her through when she was little. She sat on the same bench they used to feed birds from, but tonight there were no birds, only wind, and the ache of missing someone you still needed. She folded her hands in her lap. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from emptiness. "I don't know how to do this without her," she said softly, to no one. No answer. Just the distant sound of wind through leaves, and then a deeper silence, the kind that feels almost holy. Her eyes closed, and in that quiet, something settled. Not comfort, not peace, not yet, but presence, unseen, unspoken. But there, for the first time since the call, tears came, slow and silent, slipping down her cheeks like rain on a quiet window. She didn't try to stop them. They weren't loud. They weren't wild. They were just true. And sometimes, truth is the beginning of healing. Grace didn't pray, not in words, but her heart did. Every heartbeat was a whisper. "I miss her. I'm lost. I need you." And heaven listened. She didn't see him, not with her eyes, but if she had, she might have noticed the figure sitting beside her on the bench. Quiet, patient, eternal, watching her with eyes that saw every wound, every sorrow, every thread of pain. Jesus didn't say a word. He just stayed, and that was enough. The days after the funeral blurred together like rain on glass. Each one looked the same, gray, quiet, and heavy. Grace moved through them like someone walking underwater. Everything was slow. Everything was muffled. Every smile she forced felt like a lie. She returned to her apartment, expecting the silence. But this time, it felt different. Hollow. Too quiet. Too loud. There were no voicemails from her grandmother waiting, no missed calls with her name, just the memory of her voice echoing in the empty spaces. Jesus is always with you. Grace wanted to believe it, but faith felt so far away, like something she had once known but had long since forgotten how to reach. She didn't feel anger, only absence. And in some ways, that was worse. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Again. The blankets were tangled around her. Her pillow felt cold and unfamiliar. Her breathing, once steady, was shallow and uneven. She stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in years, her heart broke open. Not with words, but with need. She rolled onto her side and curled into herself. "I don't even know what to say anymore," she whispered into the darkness. "I don't even know how to pray." The words cracked as they left her, raw, honest. There was no poetry in them, no structure, no holiness, as she had once been taught. They were just real, broken, bare. She held her grandmother's old cross in her hand again, her thumb tracing its edges. And then, without meaning to, she said, "Jesus, if you're still there, I just need you. Please." It wasn't a prayer, not in the way she'd been taught. There were no grand declarations, no scriptures quoted, just a single breath wrapped in desperation. But in heaven, it rang like a bell. In the quiet of her room, nothing changed, and yet everything did. Her chest didn't feel as tight. Her thoughts, though still heavy, stopped spinning long enough for her to breathe. And there, in the shadows of her little bedroom, a soft warmth settled around her. Not on her skin, but deep within. It was not physical. It was deeper than that. It was presence. The presence of someone who didn't need perfect words. Someone who understood silence, who heard even the prayers too broken to speak aloud. Her tears came again, but they weren't sharp this time. They were soft, gentle, healing. She felt held, no arms wrapped around her, no visible comfort, but she felt it. A peace that didn't make sense, a nearness she couldn't explain. And in that moment she knew, without understanding how, that she hadn't spoken to the empty air. Jesus had heard her, not because she had spoken loudly, not because she had said the right words, but because he had been waiting all along, for the moment when her heart would open, even just a little, even just once. And now the healing could begin. It would take time. There would still be sleepless nights, still tears, but she wouldn't walk them alone anymore, because she had prayed, and heaven had answered, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with love. The weekend air was crisp and quiet, carrying with it the scent of autumn. Faint wood smoke, rustling leaves, and the last warmth of fading sunlight. Grace had walked farther than she intended, her hands tucked deep into her coat pockets, her scarf snug around her neck. She didn't have a destination in mind. She just needed to get out of her apartment. The walls had begun to feel like they were closing in. Too many memories, too much quiet. The city park was nearly empty. A few children played in the distance, their laughter rising and falling like birdsong. The trees stood tall and golden, their leaves floating down like blessings from heaven. She remembered this place. It was where she and her grandmother used to come during the fall, to sit, to talk, to pray. Grace wandered until she found an old wooden bench beneath a maple tree, one she vaguely remembered. It looked older now, more weathered, like it too had been sitting in quiet waiting. She sat down with a heavy sigh. Her legs ached from the walk, but her heart ached far more. There were so many things she wanted to say, so many feelings with nowhere to go. She missed her grandmother's voice, her steadiness, her faith. Most of all, she missed being reminded that Jesus was still near. A leaf drifted down and landed beside her. She picked it up and held it in her hand, studying its veins and color. So delicate, so temporary, just like people. "Mind if I sit here?" a voice asked gently. Grace looked up, startled. A man stood beside the bench. He looked to be in his late 30s. Simple clothes, kind eyes, hands tucked into the sleeves of his coat. She nodded quietly. "Sure." He sat a few feet away, leaving plenty of space between them, For a while, they both said nothing, just sat there, watching the breeze stir the fallen leaves into slow, silent circles. Finally, he spoke. "It's a beautiful day," he said. Grace gave a faint smile. "I guess it doesn't feel that way." He nodded as though he understood. Loss can make even the sun feel cold. She turned to look at him, surprised. "How did you—" He smiled gently. "Sometimes the heart speaks before the mouth does." Grace looked away. She didn't know why she was still sitting there, why she hadn't moved. But something about the man's presence felt safe, familiar even. "I lost someone," she said quietly. "Someone I loved. Someone who reminded me I wasn't alone." "She taught you to pray, didn't she?" Her eyes widened. "How do you know that?" The man simply looked forward, watching the breeze stir through the trees. "Some people pray with words. Some pray with tears. Others pray just by showing up." He glanced at her. "You've been praying more than you think." Grace blinked, unsure how to respond. The man's eyes held something deep, like still waters that had seen many storms but remained calm. She suddenly felt her throat tighten. "I don't know if Jesus is really listening, or if he's even there." The man didn't flinch. He didn't rush to correct her. He just nodded slowly. "That's okay. He's listening even when you can't believe he is. He's walking with you even when you can't feel his steps." The wind whispered around them. "Sometimes," the man continued, "you don't find him in answers. You find him in presence, in silence, in the way you're still breathing, even when you thought you couldn't." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment something stirred in her chest. Familiar, holy. "Who are you?" she asked softly. He smiled again. "Just someone who wants you to know. You're not alone. Not now. Not ever." She blinked, and he was gone. Her eyes scanned the park, empty. No sign of footsteps, no sign of anyone walking away. Just the wind, the bench, the golden leaves, and a feeling, a deep, gentle warmth in her chest. She closed her eyes, let the tears come, and whispered, "Jesus, was that you?" No voice answered, but peace wrapped around her like a blanket. And Grace knew this wasn't just grief. This was the beginning of something holy, of a walk she wouldn't take alone. Grace never saw the stranger again. She returned to the park the next day, and the next, sat on the same bench under the same golden maple tree, hoping for another conversation, another soft-spoken truth that pierced right through her fog. But he never came. Still, something lingered from that moment, a quiet knowing, a peace that had not left her, not entirely. It moved through her like a soft undercurrent, still too faint to carry her, but strong enough to remind her she wasn't sinking anymore. That night, as rain tapped gently on her window, Grace wrapped herself in her grandmother's shawl, the one that still smelled faintly of rosewater and comfort, and sat down on the floor. No music, no distractions, just silence. And she waited, not for a miracle, not even for sleep, just for Jesus. She didn't know how to invite him. She only knew that something in her longed for him, like a child lost in the woods longs for the sound of footsteps, the sound of rescue coming close. "I don't need you to fix it all," she whispered into the stillness. "I just need to know you're here." The room didn't shift. The walls didn't glow. But somewhere in the quiet, she felt something stir, not around her, but within her. The presence came softly, like breath against a candle flame, gentle, careful not to overwhelm. It didn't crash in, it stepped in, like someone taking off their shoes at the door to sit with her in her sorrow. And in that space, Grace began to speak, not with rehearsed prayers, but with honesty. She told him everything, about her fear of being forgotten, her guilt over not being strong enough, her sadness that never seemed to run dry. And when her words ran out, she let her silence speak. Because sometimes silence says what tears and tongues cannot. She waited for condemnation, but it never came. Only stillness. Stillness that listened. And a whisper, so gentle she wasn't sure if it came from above or from the depths of her soul. "I've been here the whole time." She closed her eyes, and for the first time she believed it. Not because she could see him, but because she had stopped running long enough to hear his footsteps. In the quiet, in the calm, in the sorrow that became sacred just by being shared. Grace fell asleep that night on the floor, still wrapped in her grandmother's shawl, the rain still falling. And somewhere in her dreams, she heard footsteps walking beside her, not in fear, but in peace. Morning came gently. Soft light filtered through Grace's curtains, brushing over her face like the touch of a mother waking her child. The rain had passed, leaving the world washed and quiet. A stillness remained in the air, not heavy, not hollow, but comforting. Like something sacred had happened in the night. Grace sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping on the floor. Her grandmother's shawl clung to her shoulders like a hug she still needed. She didn't rush to start the day. For once, there were no alarms blaring, no meetings crowding her calendar, just space, silence, breath. She walked to the kitchen, made herself tea, and then, without knowing exactly why, she drifted toward the hallway closet. It was where she had kept her grandmother's things since the funeral. She hadn't gone through most of them yet. It had felt too soon, too tender. But today, something nudged her. She opened the old cedar drawer, the one that always smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. Inside were her grandmother's journals, a few photographs, and a small folded envelope with her name written in delicate looping script. Grace, for when you need it most. Her breath caught. She sat down on the carpet, the envelope shaking slightly in her hands. She knew that handwriting. She'd seen it on every birthday card, every handwritten recipe, every quiet note slipped into her childhood lunchbox. But this was different. This was meant for now. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside was a single page. My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, then you've come to one of those days when the world feels heavier than you can carry, and my heart aches that I'm not there to hold your hand through it. But I want you to remember something, sweet girl, something I tried to whisper into your soul since you were little. Jesus is still with you, not just when the sun is shining, not just when your faith feels strong, but even now, especially now. When your hands are empty and your heart is tired, He is holding the pieces of you that you feel are slipping away. There were days in my life when I thought I couldn't go on. I've cried in the dark just like you. I've asked God if He truly saw me. And you know what? He always answered. Not in thunder, not in lightning, but in love. Sometimes His answer was just being there. Just peace that didn't make sense. Just strength I didn't know I had. I see that same strength in you. So if you can't pray, it's okay. Just whisper His name. If you can't move, just breathe. If you feel alone, remember, He is nearer than your own heartbeat, and so am I. Every time you feel warmth for no reason, every time you hear a quiet song in your soul, every time you sense peace just when you think you can't go on, that's Him. That's love. That's me too. Always with you. Grandma tears ran freely down Grace's cheeks as she read, her fingers pressed to the ink like it could somehow bring her closer. She didn't know how her grandmother had known she would need this letter, but it was as if heaven had kept it safe for the perfect moment. She folded it gently and placed it on her nightstand, beside the old wooden cross. And that night, when she lay down to sleep, she didn't ask for anything. She just whispered, "Thank you for not leaving me." And sleep came, quiet and kind, because love had spoken and Grace had listened. The weather changed that week. The skies that had once been golden and soft turned dark and wild. Thunder rolled in from the distance, low and steady like the drum beat of something ancient. Winds tugged at the corners of the city. Rain lashed against windows as if trying to get inside. Inside her apartment, Grace felt it all. Not just the storm outside, but the one inside her heart. Grief wasn't linear. She had learned that quickly. Just when she thought she could breathe again, something would hit her. An old photo, a song, a scent, and the ache would return, raw as ever. And now with the storm howling outside, the memories came flooding in again. She stood by the window, watching lightning paint the sky. She remembered being little, afraid of storms. Her grandmother would wrap her in a blanket, hold her close, and whisper, "The storm always sounds louder than it is." But Jesus is louder still, Grace. His peace is stronger than thunder. Tonight she tried to believe that, but everything inside her felt fragile. She felt the loneliness pressing in again, and doubt creeping back like a shadow. Had she imagined everything? The peace? The stranger on the bench? The letter? She wrapped her arms around herself and sat down on the edge of her bed. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out. Darkness. She waited, her breath caught. Only the sound of the storm remained. The wind howling, the thunder cracking, the silence in between, wide and terrifying. Then she felt it. Not fear, not panic, but stillness. A strange, holy stillness in the middle of chaos. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders relaxed, and her heart, though heavy, began to settle. Grace closed her eyes, and in the quiet between thunderclaps, she heard it, not with her ears, but in her soul. Peace, be still. She recognized the words. Her grandmother had quoted them often. Even the wind and waves obey him, she used to say. So do the storms inside us, if we let him speak into them. Grace whispered, almost without thinking, Jesus, speak into my storm. No lightning flashed inside her, but peace began to rise like a gentle tide. Not the peace of everything being fixed, not the peace of understanding, but the kind of peace that doesn't make sense, the kind that stays, even when the storm rages, even when the lights are out, even when the heart feels weak. She laid back on her bed, still wrapped in shadows, but she wasn't afraid, because something had changed. The storm hadn't stopped, but she was no longer alone in it. And slowly, in that quiet surrender, she drifted into sleep, cradled not by certainty, but by presence. The presence of the one who speaks peace into every storm. The next morning, the storm was gone, but its traces remained. Branches scattered across the sidewalks, puddles reflecting a sky trying to smile again. And inside Grace's heart, something new, something steady, a quiet strength, like the first dry ground after a flood. She walked to the little corner church that afternoon. It wasn't Sunday, and she hadn't planned on going. But as she passed it on her way to the market, something tugged at her heart. The building stood small and humble, its stained glass windows dusty with age, its wooden door slightly creaky. Inside, it smelled like old wood, wax, and something faintly sweet, like memories. No one else was there. Grace walked softly to the side of the sanctuary, where rows of small white candles flickered beneath a wooden cross. Some had burned all the way down. Others were still new. Each one seemed to hold a whisper, a story, a prayer. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then slowly she knelt. She lit a candle, small, simple, and she didn't say a word. She just watched it burn. The flame danced gently, steady and warm. Something about it calmed her, as if the candle was doing the praying for her, holding her ache with its quiet light. She reached into her coat pocket and touched the letter, her grandmother's letter. She had carried it with her every day since she found it, folded carefully, pressed against her heart like a promise. As she sat there, someone else entered the sanctuary. Grace didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the flame. The footsteps came closer, then paused beside her. She thought the person might speak, but they didn't. Instead, they knelt too, lighting a candle of their own. For a while, the two just knelt side by side in silence. No names, no explanations, just shared stillness. Grace finally whispered, not sure why or to whom, "Sometimes I think my faith is like this candle, small, weak, flickering." The person beside her answered softly, "But it's still burning." Grace turned and looked. It was a woman, older, gentle eyes. Her face held kindness, not loud or showy, but deep and knowing. "I've seen many people come here," the woman said, "some full of joy, some crushed by sorrow. But the candle that's lit in grief often shines the longest, because it means something." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. The woman smiled gently. "Jesus sees even the smallest light you offer him. He doesn't need a fire, just a flame." Grace looked at her candle again. It burned steady now, and in her heart something caught fire. not wildly, but faithfully. She realized then, it wasn't about how much faith she had, it was about where she placed it. Even a flicker, when placed in Jesus' hands, became enough. More than enough. When she stood to leave, she looked back at the candle one last time. It still burned. So did she. It was a Thursday afternoon when Grace's phone buzzed with an unexpected message from her old college friend Lena. They hadn't spoken in over a year, not since before her grandmother got sick. The message was simple. Thinking of you. Want to meet for coffee? At first, Grace hesitated. She didn't feel like catching up, smiling politely, or pretending to be okay. But something inside nudged her, softly but persistently. She replied, "Yes, tomorrow?" The coffee shop was quiet when she arrived. It was the kind of place that smelled like roasted beans and baked hope. Soft jazz played in the background. She spotted Lena at a corner table by the window, waving with her usual brightness. They hugged. It felt safe. Lena had always been gentle with people's pain. She didn't ask questions too quickly or offer band-aid words. Instead, she just listened. They talked for a while, about small things, everyday things. Grace found herself smiling more than she expected. Then Lena leaned in, her eyes kind. "I heard about your grandmother. I'm so sorry, Grace." And just like that, the dam broke. Grace felt the tears prick her eyes. She lowered her gaze and whispered, "It's been really hard. Some days I feel like I'm disappearing." Lena reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "Then let me remind you who you are." Grace looked up. "You're not lost. You're not forgotten. You're still Grace. Even when you feel broken, even when you don't feel strong, you are still full of purpose, still seen, still loved." The words washed over her like warm rain, and something strange happened. Grace suddenly remembered something her grandmother used to say. "You don't always meet Jesus in a vision. Sometimes he hides inside people who love well." Maybe this was one of those moments. Maybe this was Jesus, wearing Lena's voice, her kindness, her understanding. As they walked out of the coffee shop, Lena paused. "Hey," she said with a smile. "Want to stop by somewhere real quick? It's just around the corner." Grace nodded. They walked a few blocks until they reached a small, quiet building with an old wooden sign. Grace House, Shelter for Women and Children. Grace blinked. Lena glanced at her. "I volunteer here sometimes. I thought maybe you'd want to visit. You have a way of making people feel safe. You always have." Inside the shelter, the air was filled with the sound of small voices, gentle music, and the soft thud of toys on the carpet. A little girl ran past, giggling. Another woman sat by the window, rocking a baby. And on the wall, painted in elegant script, were these words, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9. Grace stood still. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from something else. Recognition, healing, a whisper of destiny. She realized in that moment, she wasn't just named Grace, she was becoming it. Her pain had not disqualified her. It had equipped her to see, to feel, to love deeply, and in a place built for the weary, the forgotten, the broken. Grace finally met herself again, not the version that was strong all the time, but the version Jesus had always seen. Gentle, resilient, healing. Grace turned to Lena and whispered, "Thank you." Lena smiled. "Maybe you're ready to help carry someone else's storm." And for the first time in months, Grace didn't feel exhausted. She felt whole. The first time Grace returned to the shelter alone, she hesitated at the door. She stood there, heart pounding softly, wondering if she really belonged in a place built for healing, especially when she still felt like she was healing herself. But the moment she stepped inside, a little boy looked up from his coloring book, grinned, and waved like he'd been waiting just for her. Something shifted. That smile opened a door inside her, and she walked through it without even realizing. She spent that afternoon folding clothes, sorting toys, and helping serve lunch. No grand conversations, no heroic moments, just presence, just kindness. And strangely, With every small act of service, her own soul began to breathe again. There was a woman named Marisol who came to the shelter every Thursday. She barely spoke, always kept her head down, and wore long sleeves even in the heat. Grace noticed the pain in her eyes, the kind that spoke without words. One Thursday, as Grace handed Marisol a warm bowl of soup, their fingers touched. And for just a moment, Marisol looked up. Not long, not deep, just enough to meet Grace's eyes. It was all Grace needed. She smiled gently. "You're safe here." Marisol's lips didn't move, but her eyes softened. A tiny shift, a tiny miracle. That night, as Grace lay in bed, she thought about all the tiny miracles she'd seen at the shelter. A mother who hadn't laughed in weeks chuckled at a toddler's silly joke. A teen who refused help finally accepted a warm blanket. A woman who hadn't touched a Bible in years quietly asked for one. Grace realized something. Healing doesn't always happen in silence and solitude. Sometimes it happens in community, and sometimes the very act of helping others heal becomes a salve for your own wounds. It wasn't that her pain was gone, it wasn't, but now her pain had purpose. One morning, Grace stayed after closing hours to help mop the floors. As she cleaned, she found herself humming a melody she didn't recognize. Soft, slow, almost like a lullaby. She stopped and listened. The song wasn't hers. It was in her, yes, but it felt like it had come from somewhere else. She closed her eyes, and in the stillness of that quiet, empty room, she felt it again. Him, not in thunder, not in fire, not in voices, but in peace, in warmth, in music only the soul could hear. A whisper, deep and certain, rose in her spirit. "You are doing holy work." Grace opened her eyes, tears pooling again. Not from sadness, but from that deep, holy knowing that Jesus was not only with her, he was working through her. She looked at her hands, hands that had once only reached out in desperation. Now they were healing hands, helping hands, hands that carried bowls, folded blankets, wiped away tears, hers and others. And in that moment, Grace realized she hadn't found healing and then gone to serve. She had begun to heal because she served, and somehow in the helping, she had been helped. The days passed gently. Grace found a rhythm, not the fast, frantic pace she had once lived by, but a slower, soul-deep rhythm. Morning tea, a walk, a visit to the shelter, a quiet evening with a journal and prayer. Her life was no longer full, but it was rich. And yet, there were still moments of doubt, flickers of fear that whispered, "What if I fall again? What if the peace fades? What if I lose him in the noise like before?" On one of those days, Grace took a walk through the old city park near her childhood home. It had been years since she'd visited. Trees lined the cobblestone paths like guardians. The air smelled of moss, memory, and something ancient. She sat on a bench beneath a willow tree. Nearby, a small sparrow fluttered down onto the path. It hopped around, pecked at a few crumbs, and then flew up to a branch above her. Grace smiled. Simple, unbothered, free. She whispered, "I wish I had faith like that." An old man approached, leaning on a cane. His beard was white, his eyes soft, and he wore a hat that looked older than the park itself. He moved slowly, like someone who had learned not to rush holy moments. He sat on the far end of the bench. "You spoke to the bird," he said gently. Grace chuckled softly. "I guess I did." "She's not worried," he said, "because she knows the shepherd watches even over sparrows." Grace turned toward him. "The shepherd?" He smiled kindly. "The one who said, 'Do not be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows.'" He paused, then added, "Jesus." His voice held weight, not heavy, but rooted, like someone who had walked with God through both valleys and mountaintops. Grace blinked, startled. "I haven't heard that verse in years." The old man nodded. "That's the thing about truth. Even when we forget it, it waits quietly, like a shepherd, gently calling us back." He pointed at the sparrow again. "She doesn't worry because she knows where her care comes from. You can too." Grace looked down, feeling the warmth of conviction settle in her chest. "Sometimes I still feel like I'm not strong enough, like I'll slip back into the fear, the sadness, the loneliness. The old man leaned forward, his eyes shining. The shepherd does not abandon the sheep when they're weak. He carries them. He leaves the 99 to find the one. And even if that one strays again and again, he never tires of bringing her home. Tears rose in Grace's eyes. She hadn't told him anything, but somehow he knew. Not the details maybe, but the ache, the journey, the fragility of her hope. He stood slowly, adjusting his coat. Before he turned to go, he said, "Your name is not an accident. You carry it well." Grace looked up. "Do I know you?" He smiled a little wistfully. "Not yet, but you will." And with that, he walked away. Grace watched him disappear down the path, sparrows fluttering from branch to branch above her. She looked up into the sky, where soft clouds drifted in silence. Her heart, once so full of questions, felt suddenly quiet. He watches over the sparrows, and he watches over me. Grace whispered, "Thank you, Jesus." And the breeze that rustled through the leaves felt like a gentle, "You're welcome." There were valleys that stretched longer than others. Grace had come far since the days of numbness and endless tears. Yet healing wasn't a straight path. It wound and turned, often taking her through quiet struggles, moments when she still felt the ache of absence, the shadows of what had been lost. It was during one of those gray weeks in early spring that she felt the weight again. Nothing particularly bad happened, but the old heaviness crept in. It was subtle at first. Sleepless nights, a distant stare, an invisible fog around her heart. It puzzled her. She had been doing so well. Why did it feel like a step backward? On a quiet Sunday, she returned to the countryside, to the old cabin her grandmother once took her to when life felt too loud. The air smelled of pine and dew, and the hills rolled like waves frozen in time. She took a walk along a narrow trail that wound through trees and opened onto a wide valley. And there, beneath the weight of sky and silence, she let herself cry. Not the desperate tears of the past, but gentle ones. Cleansing. Real. She sat on a flat stone and let the silence settle around her like a blanket. Then came the memory. She was 7 years old again, sitting next to her grandmother on this very trail. Her knees were scraped from a fall, and she was pouting. Her grandmother had pointed to the mountains on the horizon. "Do you see those peaks, Grace?" She nodded through her sniffles. "They're strong because they don't fight the valleys. The valleys make them higher." She hadn't understood then, but now she did. The valley didn't mean she was failing. It meant she was climbing. Every moment of sadness, every quiet step of faith, every whisper of surrender, it was building something inside her. Something deep, something high, a mountain. And suddenly, in the quiet of the valley, she felt him again. Not in words, not in visions, but in presence, a stillness, a warmth, a sacred knowing. She stood slowly and whispered, "You're here, even now." The wind rustled the tall grass like a reply. She looked across the valley and smiled, not because the ache was gone, but because she had found the truth in it. The shepherd wasn't waiting for her on the mountaintop. He was walking with her through the valley, and somehow, that made her valley holy. That evening, as the sun sank and painted the sky with soft orange and violet, Grace lit a small fire outside the cabin. She sat alone, wrapped in a blanket, but not lonely. She had walked through darkness and discovered the light never left her. She had climbed without realizing, and now in the quiet glow of twilight, she saw it. The mountain was not around her. The mountain was within her. The morning after her walk in the valley, Grace woke to a gentle hush outside the cabin. The air was cool and crisp, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and wet soil. The fire in the hearth had burned low, but the peace in her spirit had not faded. If anything, it had deepened, like a still pond holding the sky in its reflection. She made tea, wrapped herself in her grandmother's old shawl, and stepped outside. The trees stood quiet and golden. Autumn had come to the forest overnight. The leaves, once green, now whispered in warm hues, amber, russet, deep gold, as if they too were letting go of something old and embracing something new. She wandered along the familiar trail, her boots crunching softly over fallen leaves. As she rounded a bend near the brook, something unusual caught her eye. A folded piece of paper wedged between two stones, weighed down by a pine cone. She knelt, curious, and gently lifted it. The paper was weathered but dry, like it had been protected. There was handwriting on it, delicate, flowing, unmistakably her grandmother's. Grace's breath caught. Hands trembling slightly, she unfolded the note. It read, "My dear Grace, if you're reading this, it means you've returned to this place, our place. Maybe you're tired, maybe you're searching. Maybe life has asked more of you than you feel you can give. I want you to know something. Jesus is with you, not just in the joyful moments, not just when things go well, but here now, in the quiet, in the ache, in the mystery. You've always had a deep heart, a tender one. That's not a weakness, Grace. That's the soil where compassion grows. That's where Jesus plants his love. When you walk through the valley, he walks with you. When you sit in silence, he listens. When you cry, he catches every tear. And when you think you're alone, oh my darling, look again. You are never alone. Let the leaves fall. Let them teach you that letting go is not the end. It's the beginning of becoming. With all my love, Grandma Grace held the letter to her heart and wept, not in sorrow, but in sacred release, the way only someone who knows they are fully loved can weep. The forest stood around her like a chapel. The wind moved gently through the trees, lifting the leaves like prayers into the sky. And she felt it again, that presence, that beautiful, quiet presence. She didn't need to see Jesus to know he was there. The timing of the letter, the peace in the air, the gentle warmth in her chest. It was all him. As she stood, the wind lifted a few golden leaves and carried them across her path, dancing lightly before her feet. It felt like an invitation, so she walked forward, freer, softer, braver. That evening, she tucked the letter into her journal, not as a keepsake, but as a compass, because now she knew. Even when the trail is covered in fallen leaves, God leaves a message for those who seek. A whisper in the wind, a promise in paper, a savior in the stillness. The weeks that followed Grace's return from the cabin felt like moving through a sacred hush. Everything in her life had slowed, not because she had nothing to do, but because she no longer rushed through what mattered. Each morning, she began her day in silence. No phone, no lists, no distractions, just stillness. Stillness and Jesus. It was during one of those quiet mornings when the stars had just begun to fade and the world held its breath before sunrise that she felt the whisper. She couldn't explain it. It wasn't a voice in her ear. It wasn't even a thought. It was a knowing, a gentle nudge in her soul that said, "Come meet me before the dawn." Grace rose from her bed, wrapped herself in a cardigan, and stepped outside into the cool darkness. The sky above her was deep indigo, scattered with stars. The earth below was hushed and waiting. It felt like even the wind had paused. She walked to the small garden behind her house. There, surrounded by lavender and old rose bushes, she sat on the wooden bench her grandfather had built years ago, and she waited. The night didn't speak, but it didn't feel empty. She thought of all the moments in her life when Jesus had met her in the quiet. On the hospital floor, when she had whispered, "Help me," and peace had arrived like a flood. In the shelter, when a child's laughter had cracked open her grief. In the valley, when the mountain inside her had risen from the soil of sorrow. In the letter hidden in the leaves. Now in the darkness before dawn, she realized something powerful. He had never been louder than when he spoke in whispers, because whispers are for the ones close enough to hear, and she had drawn close. The horizon began to soften, turning from indigo to pale blue, and then, quietly, like a secret being told, the sun rose, not with noise, not with drama, but with light, gentle golden light that spread across the garden, touching everything with grace. And in that holy silence, Grace heard it again, not with her ears, but her spirit. "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." John 8-12. Grace smiled through tears. The darkness hadn't left her life in a single moment, but dawn had come, slowly, softly, faithfully. And now she understood. The whisper that calls you out before the sun rises is the same voice that lit the stars, the same voice that calms storms, the same voice that called her name when she was lost. And that voice still whispers, I am here. I have always been here, even in the darkness, especially in the darkness. That morning, Grace wrote in her journal, I no longer fear the night, because I have heard the voice of the one who owns the morning. It had been over a year since Grace's quiet collapse in the hospital hallway. The moment her soul had whispered, I can't do this anymore. And yet now she found herself breathing differently, deeper, slower, with faith that didn't need to explain itself. She was no longer just surviving. She was walking with Jesus, still healing, still learning, but no longer lost. One afternoon, as the sky shifted with the colors of early fall, Grace visited the small chapel near the edge of town, a place she had once avoided, then later stumbled into during one of her loneliest nights. She hadn't planned to go inside. She was just walking, following the wind. But as she passed the wooden doors, she noticed something strange. The door was slightly open. It creaked gently in the breeze like it had been waiting for someone. Grace paused. Her old instincts whispered, don't go in. You don't need a sign. But her spirit leaned in, like a child drawn to light under a door in a dark hallway. So she stepped inside. The chapel was empty, soaked in quiet. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting the worn pews in soft colors. Dust floated like golden confetti in the stillness. She walked down the center aisle and sat near the front. No music, no sermon, just presence. She closed her eyes and she waited. She didn't even know what she was waiting for. A feeling, a word, a memory. But what came was peace. It swept over her gently, like warm oil poured over aching shoulders. She felt him, not because of the chapel, not because of the silence, but because the door had been left open, and she had chosen to walk through. She thought of all the other doors in her life, doors she had slammed in pain, doors others had locked, doors she was too afraid to open, and then she thought of him. Jesus, who never forces, Jesus, who never rushes, Jesus, who said, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with them, and they with me. Revelation 3:20. She imagined him standing at every moment of her life, gently knocking, not demanding entrance, but always waiting with love. And now the roles had reversed. She was the one who had found the door open, and Jesus was the one who had left it that way. Because love never slams doors. It leaves them ajar, just enough for light to slip through. Before she left the chapel, she lit a small candle and whispered, thank you for not walking away. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for leaving the door open. And as she stepped out into the evening air, she looked back and smiled. Somehow she knew, no matter how far she wandered, no matter how many times she fell, there would always be a door open and a savior waiting on the other side. It had been raining for 3 days straight, not the fierce, angry kind of storm, but the soft, steady rain that feels more like weeping than thunder. Gentle, persistent, cleansing. Grace sat by her window, wrapped in a blanket, watching raindrops slide down the glass like tiny rivers. Her journal lay open on her lap, filled with prayers, thoughts, and the slow unfolding of her soul over the past months. Outside, the garden was soaked, yet somehow more alive than ever. Every leaf glistened. The world looked like it had been baptized, and Grace felt the echo of that. She had cried enough tears to fill a river, but now those tears felt different, not like loss, more like release. She remembered once reading, "He collects all your tears in a bottle." It had sounded poetic, beautiful, almost too beautiful. But now she believed it, because there were places in her soul, places once scorched and barren, that were finally blooming. The rain had softened something inside her, not just the grief, but the resistance. Later that afternoon, she walked out into the rain. No umbrella, no shoes, just the feel of cool water on her skin and the sacred hush of earth receiving heaven. She walked to the center of her yard, looked up at the gray sky, and whispered through tears, "Jesus, I'm not afraid anymore." It wasn't a declaration of strength. It was surrender. It was her way of saying, I trust you even in the rain. I trust you with the parts of me that still ache. I trust that you use tears the way you use rain, to soften, to cleanse, to prepare the soil for something new. The next morning, the sky broke open into gold. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the wooden floors and Grace's upturned face. She stepped outside barefoot, and the garden greeted her like an old friend. Everywhere, life. Tiny shoots of green pushing up from the soil. Flowers nodding with dew. A small sparrow hopping between puddles. She stood still, breathing it in. And then she heard it, not with her ears, but her heart. The same rain that once felt like drowning was the water I used to make you grow. Tears welled in her eyes again, but not sorrowful ones. These were the tears that come when you realize you've survived, when you've been remade, when your soul finally feels at home. She walked to the edge of the garden and sat on the old bench beneath the tree. The rain had left behind silence and softness, and in that holy quiet, she wrote in her journal, sometimes the miracle isn't that the storm ends. Sometimes the miracle is what grows in you because of it. There are moments in life when you go looking for the light, and then there are moments when the light finds you. It was a simple morning. Grace was cleaning out the attic of her grandmother's old house, a slow, dusty project she'd been putting off for months. Cobwebs stretched across wooden beams like silver lace, and the air was thick with the scent of time. She found old photo albums, holiday decorations, forgotten teacups, and a box labeled Letters Keep. Curious, she opened it. Inside were dozens of envelopes, worn soft from being opened and reread. Most were from her grandfather, some from friends long gone. But one envelope was unmarked. No address, no name. Just folded parchment tied with a faded ribbon. She untied it slowly, her heart sensing it was something sacred. Inside, written in her grandmother's flowing hand, was a prayer. Lord Jesus, if ever my Grace forgets how much she's loved, if she ever doubts your presence, let her find the light again. Even if it's not through me, let her know she's never alone. Even if she can't see it, let her feel it. Even if she's in darkness, let the light find her. Because you found me once when I was lost, and I know you'll do the same for her. Amen. Grace sat frozen. A lump formed in her throat. She looked around the attic, dusty, quiet, forgotten, but somehow holy, because in that moment, she felt it. The light, not sunlight, not electricity, but a soft inner brightness, a warmth in her chest, a stillness around her shoulders. And she knew she was being seen, she was being held, she was being found again by the same Jesus who had walked with her through every ache, every silence, every valley. By the same Jesus who had whispered in the rain, waited at the open door, and tucked love letters into leaves. She didn't need to find him. He had already found her, over and over and over again. Later that evening, as the sun poured gold across the horizon, she stood in the doorway of the attic and looked out toward the hills. The light wrapped around her like a soft garment, and she whispered, "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for coming after me when I didn't know how to look for you. Thank you for finding me." In her journal that night, she wrote, "I used to chase peace like it was far away, but now I see peace was always chasing me. And love never left, even in the dark. The light always knew where I was." There was a small bistro on the edge of town. Grace had passed it many times, charming, quiet, lit by golden lamps in the evening. But she had never gone in. It always seemed too beautiful for one person to sit alone. She remembered once thinking, that's a place for couples, for families, for people who belong somewhere. But now, she belonged to herself, to the Savior who had never once left her. So on a gentle Saturday evening, Grace dressed simply, let her hair fall loose, and walked through the doors of the little bistro. A waiter greeted her with a warm smile. "Just one tonight?" She nodded. "Yes, just one." But in her heart, she thought, not really, never just one. He led her to a small table near the window. The napkin was folded with care. A single candle flickered gently. A glass of water sat waiting. She sat down slowly, letting the moment wrap around her like a song. There had been a time when this would have hurt, a table for one, a symbol of loneliness. But tonight, it was something else entirely. It was sacred, because she knew Jesus was with her, not in the shadows, not in the future, but here, now across from her, in her, around her. Every sip of water, every bite of bread, every flicker of candlelight. It was communion, not the ritual, but the reality. The kind that happens in quiet places when you finally understand that being alone doesn't mean being abandoned. She remembered the verse, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Psalm 23:5. And she smiled. The enemies had once been anxiety, exhaustion, self-doubt. Now she sat at peace, eating slowly, breathing deeply, eyes full of wonder. This table, this moment, wasn't just for one. It had been set by love, in love, for her healing. After dinner, she wrote in her journal, "Tonight I dined with the king. No trumpet, no crowds, just silence, bread, and presence." And somehow, that was more than enough. As she walked home under the stars, she whispered, "Jesus, thank you for saving a seat. Even when I didn't think I belonged at the table, you saved one for me anyway." The night was quiet. Grace lay in bed beneath the open window, the cool night air brushing softly against her face. The world outside had gone still. No cars, no voices, just the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional cry of a distant owl. But inside her heart, there was no fear, not anymore. Once the night had frightened her. Once the silence had echoed too loudly with memories and pain. Once darkness had meant alone. Now it meant something else entirely. It meant rest, not just for her body, but for her soul. She remembered the verse that had once sounded too beautiful to be real. "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Psalm 23:2-3. And she knew it was true, all of it. Jesus, her shepherd, had led her through valleys, storms, and seasons of crushing sorrow. He had waited for her at closed doors. He had whispered to her before the dawn. He had wept with her in the rain. He had found her in the attic. He had sat with her at the table. He had never once left her side. And now, as sleep pulled gently at her eyes, she felt him again. Not with her hands, not with her sight, but with her spirit. There was a presence in the room, a peace that was more than stillness, a person. She didn't need to say anything. She simply turned her heart toward him, like a flower toward the light, and let herself be held. Before her eyes closed completely, she whispered, "Thank you, Jesus, for being my shepherd, for watching while I sleep, for walking every step beside me, for carrying me when I could no longer walk, for knowing my name and never forgetting where I am." That night, Grace dreamt of fields soaked in golden light, of still waters so clear she could see her soul reflected, of a shepherd, gentle and strong, walking beside her. And when she awoke with tears on her cheeks, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were the kind that come when you finally come home. In her final journal entry, she wrote, "He never left me, even when I walked through the valley, even when I doubted, even when I was angry, exhausted, or numb. He was there. I have learned this truth like a melody. The shepherd never sleeps, and I am never alone."